Hello and welcome to Thinking Out Loud. I'm Gloria Polites, your host, and with me today in the studio is Bob Forrant, a professor of history at UMass Lowell, and one of my colleagues at UMass Lowell, who has expertise in many fields, but today we're going to talk about his involvement with the Bread and Roses Centennial. It's been 100 years since the Bread and Roses strike in Lawrence, Massachusetts, and he knows all about it. And then we'll probably talk about labor today.
Okay, sounds like a plan.
All right. So tell us a little bit about the Bread and Roses strike and how we celebrated it. And
well, it is the 100th anniversary, so we started back in January, actually January 12th, on almost to the dot of time, 100 years before that the strike began. And the strike itself is something memorable in American labor history. It's probably one of the most remembered of all strikes. There have been hundreds of strikes in the history of the United States, but it's one that if anybody anywhere has some labor history at all, they know about that strike. And it's for several reasons. One is it was really one of the first times in U.S. history that such a wide variety of immigrant groups were able to get together and fight for something together. Lawrence was just a huge immigrant city at the time of the strike. There were over 30 nationalities, all those different languages. And so the idea that many people could get together, cross their differences in language and culture and food and everything, religion, all of it, and stand firm was a pretty incredible thing. So that's one of the reasons why people really remember the strike. A second reason is that it was really a strike where women played an incredibly important role. Well over half of all the workers in the mills, about 30,000 workers in the mills of Lawrence at the time of the strike, well over half were women and children. And women really came to the fore during the strike and played a very powerful role, to the point that they actually were arrested more than men during the strike for a whole bunch of things that they did to promote the strike. And so for both of those reasons, it's really become something that people think about, study. How is it possible that this unity was created? What roles did in fact women play? And how was the strike so successful against the woolen industry, which was the dominant industry in Lawrence? Lowell was more cotton, Lawrence much more wool, but the woolen, about somewhere between 25 and 30% of all the wool produced in the country came from Lawrence. And so the wool mill owners were a very powerful economic entity, and they were defeated outright by the time the strike was over. So it's pretty legendary.
I imagine. Now, how long did the strike go on?
The strike lasts from January 12th. January 11 and 12, the first workers walk out, and there's a large vote taken on the Lawrence Common to end the strike in the middle of March, March 15th, and workers go back to work a couple days later. So it's pretty incredible as well to think about. This happens during the winter. And a lot of the strike meetings that are held, the meetings where workers are talking about what's going on, being kept informed about whether there's any negotiations with the mill owners or not, almost all those meetings are outside during the winter. And every one of those meetings, as they're taking place, most of them on the Lawrence Common, the goings-on, the proceedings, the speakers, everything's being translated into all these different languages. So meetings take a bit longer than they would if somebody was just speaking in one language, and so several of the strike leaders speak multiple languages. It's really pretty amazing. But then when that doesn't happen, groups of people will stand together who might understand Italian, and if somebody's speaking in French, somebody who understands French and Italian will stand with that group of workers and be simultaneously translating the French into Italian. So there was great care taken to build that unity, because the strike leaders at the time knew if the mill owners could divide workers by either nationality or gender, then the strike would be lost. And so they tried desperately to divide the workers, and meanwhile the workers had created this infrastructure to make sure that didn't happen. So it's, again, that's another reason why people are interested in the strike, that ability to create such unity across such diversity.
And that was created in the course of the strike. There wasn't,
There was actually a lot of the sort of the buildup, that creation was really done before the strike started. What had happened was in 1911, the Massachusetts legislature passed a new law, state legislature passed a law saying that the legal work week for women and children would be cut from 56 to 54 hours. And this had happened before, 2 years previous, it had been cut from 58 to 56. When it went from 58 to 56, wages were not cut for workers. When it was announced that this was going to happen and go 56, 54, workers tried meeting with mill owners to find out what was going to happen to their wages, and the mill owners refused to meet with them. So they pretty much took it for granted that if the mill owners were not meeting with them, then that meant their wages were going to be cut. Mill owners are more likely to want to give you good news than bad, right? So, so they know, like in the fall of 1911, the odds are pretty good that come January, when they get their first paycheck, their wages will be cut. So they're meeting, they're creating this organizational structure in all the neighborhoods, unbeknownst to the mill owners. So there's very interesting sort of neighborhood organizing, block to block, in buildings, whatever, almost like an election campaign, a get out the vote campaign, only it's to build unity, just in case people's wages are cut. And the thing about Lawrence is that Lawrence is really tiny. It's only about 6.5 square miles. So it's essentially mills and worker housing. And so in all these neighborhoods around the mills, everybody walks to work. And so in these neighborhoods nearby all the mills, all this organizing is going on, sort of a what-if scenario. If, in fact, our wages are cut, what do we do? So there was a good deal of preparation that went on before that. The Industrial Workers of the World, a very radical labor organization in the U.S. at the time, was in Lawrence. There were 20 small language organizations of the IWW, like Polish, Italian, Lithuanian, German-speaking, French, Dutch. So there were these small groups, maybe comprised of about 2,000 workers. So out of about 30,000, maybe 2,000. But those folks did a lot of organization. So on the day that people realized their wages were cut, and on the 12th, when everybody got paid, they came out of the mills. There were several thousand people that walked off the job. The mill owners thought, so that's a Friday, the 12th is a Friday, the mill owners thought that come Monday, everybody would go back to work. That's not what happened. The strike grew significantly from there, and then in the middle of that next week, English-speaking workers who hadn't been involved in much of this earlier organization took a vote to join the strike, at which point the mill owners were really up the river. Again, they were banking on those divisions, and once those workers agreed as well to participate in the strike, it was pretty much a foregone conclusion that the strike would remain solid.
Right, so they really laid that groundwork.
Yep. Yeah, again, it wasn't some spontaneous, magical happening, which is the way I learned about it when I first learned about it in school. It was just an amazing, incredible, almost like the virgin birth. And, you know, sort of like that, or, you know, immaculate conception, whatever metaphor you want to use. That's not what this was. It was very careful organization.
A lot of times we don't get that background in schools.
Yeah, no, not at all.
That's what makes it interesting. But they were 3 months, right, without work. So, I mean, they weren't getting paid. How did they survive?
What remarkably happened is once into the second week of the strike, an outpouring of support came from all over the country. There were rallies that were held to support the strike. Money was given, donations of food, other things were made. And so very quickly, support came for the strike. People, I think, around the country realized this was really an important situation. And so even, I was just reading the other day, the Lowell newspapers and their accounts of the Lawrence strike. And in Lowell, what happened is very early on in the strike, a bunch of workers from Lowell bought a cow from a local farmer, and they walked the cow to Lawrence along the river, and then gave the cow to the strikers to slaughter for meat for the soup kitchen. That was like one of the acts of solidarity. But money came in, small amounts of money from other unions, food donations. Also, there was a big sort of outpouring of support for the strike. And so there were soup kitchens set up that fed between 25 and 30,000 people. Doctors volunteered their services to like look at kids if they weren't feeling well, and strikers as well. Money arrived for bail for anybody that was arrested. Several attorneys showed up willing to represent workers if they got in any scrapes with the police or the militia when they showed up. And so there was a sort of a real welling up of broad-based support. From as far away, actually, I found photographs of strike support rallies that were held in Portland, Oregon.
My goodness.
Couldn't get much further
Across
away.
The country, right.
And so that's how widespread the support was for the strike. It was covered in all the media. New York Times sent reporters. Washington, D.C. newspapers sent reporters. Eventually reporters came from Italy, Germany, France, England, because the workforce was made up largely of immigrants from those places. So it was covered worldwide. It became well known everywhere.
It was an international...
Yeah, it became pretty much like a symbolic of an international sort of struggle against mill owners and unfair treatment of mill workers.
Right. And it was bubbling up because the courts pretty much struck down any attempts at that time still, right? I mean, they hadn't turned the corner.
Yeah, no, I mean, it was, very quickly, the third or fourth day in the strike, the mayor of Lawrence appeals to the governor of Massachusetts to send the militia, the equivalent today of the National Guard. The militia is there to defend the mills and the property and to roust the strikers, not to, so it's very unfair leverage. Harvard University, the president of Harvard University offers to all the students who are in exam period at Harvard, if they want to come to Lawrence as part of the militia, they'll get a C for their exams. They can bypass taking their mid-year exams and join this militia. And so Harvard students show up in Lawrence as part of a cavalry riding around with guns with bayonets on the end of them, prodding strikers and trying to suppress the strike. But sort of the corollary to the Harvard story is that Wellesley, Radcliffe, Smith, Mount Holyoke, the students, women's colleges, the students from all those women's colleges arrive in Lawrence to work in the soup kitchen, to volunteer to help raise money and do all sorts of things in support of the strike. Two Wellesley College professors are almost fired from Wellesley for coming to Lawrence and speaking out in favor of the strike. The Board of Trustees tries to fire them. The students rally to their defense and they're not fired. So it's a very colorful kind of an event, right? It's for me, for a history teacher, it's like you can't get something better.
No,
you know, you've got everything
drama,
going. Yeah, you got all kind of stuff. It's really cool.
And you said a lot of women were arrested, even more than men. So what happened to the children?
Well, the women are arrested for a variety of activities pretty much against the militia. One of their favorite tactics, they wear these big floppy hats back in the day, and they're held on their heads with hat pins. And so when the militia rides down on them on horseback and sort of confronts a group of women strikers, a couple of them will circle around behind the horses, stick the horses in the rear end with the hat pin. The militia man will be tossed off the horse into a snowbank, and then a group of women will pummel him until he can get up and get away. And so they're arrested a lot for things like that. But what happens with the kids is that by early in February, the strike's been going maybe 3 weeks at this point, because the tensions are so high in the city. 2 workers have lost their lives already in the strike. Workers use a tactic that they import from Europe, that they've seen in strikes they've been involved in themselves before they came to the United States, of sending children to supportive families elsewhere around Lawrence. And so hundreds of people, hundreds of families volunteer to take in the children of strikers. And so they go to Barre, Vermont, they go to Boston, they go to New York City, Philadelphia, several cities in Connecticut for safekeeping during the strike. And so that's one of the ways that some of the economic pressure on families is reduced. They can send their kids away, they know they're safe, they're eating 3 meals a day, they're in school wherever they go. And so that's what happens with a lot of the kids. And when the kids are being sent away, and when they get to New York City or Boston or Philadelphia, wherever they go, there are big parades, and it really sort of increases visibility of the strike and support for the strike. So the mayor of Lawrence and the head of the militia decide no more kids can leave. And so a confrontation follows on February 24th at the train station in Lawrence, where the kids are there to get on a train to go to Philadelphia. Their chaperones have come up from Philadelphia. They're waiting in the train station to bring about 50 kids to Philadelphia. And the militia essentially physically prevents mothers and kids from getting on the trains, and actually beats up the kids and the women and arrests everybody and throws them into paddy wagons and takes them to jail. And this backfires on on the mill owners, because they're doing this to try to end the publicity that sending kids away gets. And now the Sunday newspapers all over the country are militia and police beat strikers' children. And it sort of turns the tables even further. So quickly after that, Congress calls for an investigation on Lawrence and the strike. And 10 child mill workers go to testify amongst other people. The president's wife, the president's William Howard Taft at the time, the president's wife is in the hearing room when the kids give their testimony about being young and underage and working in the mills and what their lives are like in the mills and all of that. She's so moved she actually writes a $5,000 check to support the strikers and the strike committee, and she invites all the kids to the White House, and they go to the White House and meet the president. So it's pretty incredible. But within a few days after that, after the mill owners having not ever once budged to meet with the strikers and negotiate any settlement, within a few days, meetings are set up, and workers go to Boston to meet with William Wood, the head of American Woolen, the biggest woolen conglomerate in the country. And fairly quickly after that, there's an agreement, and the strike is settled, and workers win all of their demands. And so people think that the incident at the train station and then these hearings put significant pressure on the mill owners. The mill owners at the time are also, woolen mills are highly protected. There's a very high tariff, a tax, on all wool coming into the United States from abroad. And it protects the woolen industry in the United States. I think, although I've never found the document, I'm dying to, I think that probably the president got a hold of William Wood and probably threatened to do something with that tariff unless he did something to move in the direction of ending the strike. And so I'm still looking for that document. If anybody out there in TV land has it in your attic, let me know.
Yeah, that'd be great.
But at any rate, that's what really propels the ending of the strike. A big strike meeting is held on the Lawrence Common, and then a huge victory parade through the streets of the city, and the workers essentially win their demands.
Right. And it's really changing the momentum, because you know, the situation at the turn of the century then, in terms of corporate power and income inequality and the struggle of unions, sort of has a parallel nowadays, I think. Do you want to talk a little bit?
Yeah,
about
I mean,
that?
I see lots of similarities. I gave a bunch of talks at the beginning of the centennial year, sort of talking about calling the strike in Lawrence in 1912 Occupy Lawrence 1912, sort of using the idea of what the Occupy movement for the last little while in this country has been about, that this truly was a strike that was a community strike. It wasn't a strike of workers in a single workplace trying to get a single thing for themselves. This really was a community on strike against the way they were being treated, the way they were being forced to live. Lawrence had one of the highest infant mortality rates in the country at the time of the strike. And so for me, the lesson when I think about today is that Lawrence was really a social movement. It wasn't a movement of a handful of workers in a building with 4 walls. This was really participatory democracy, and at least the way I think about things, in the best sense of participatory democracy. And people stood together not as workers in the Suffolk Mill or the Pacific Mill or the Wood Mill or the Atlantic Mill. They stuck together as mill workers across the entire city of Lawrence. And Wisconsin, when everything was going on there and people were occupying the State House, that was a collaboration across a variety of different workplaces. And I do think that because the economy has changed so much in the United States, we don't have any more, or we don't have as much, let's say. It's not that we don't have any, but it's much harder now to think of workplaces as containing thousands and thousands of workers at a specific site, to try to organize them and move in the direction of improving wages and working conditions and such. It does have to be a much more broad-based set of activities. And so the labor movement, I think, significantly in the last few years has really moved in this direction. And a lot of people at various levels inside the American labor movement today talk about social movement unionism. And again, this idea of organizing at the grassroots, looking at a variety of issues that affect working people, like child care, like health care, like elder care, like whatever it would be, and seeing all these things as really part and parcel of what a labor movement ought to be about. very much in the mode of sort of reconstructing the social safety net that workers were able to put together in the 1930s and has essentially been just ripped to shreds in the last 15 to 20 years. How do we reassemble that? In the 1930s as well, what happened there was an uprising that was very broad-based. It wasn't necessarily in tune to a specific workplace. It was community-wide. It was industry-wide. It was much more, you know, of that type, similar again to the Bread and Roses strike. The bigger problem, I think, now is that so much of the work that used to be done here, of the manufacturing work, is done abroad. And one of the weaknesses always of the labor movement in the United States is a real inability to extend solidarity across national borders. And that's really been to the detriment of the labor movement. And I mean, there's a long history here. When unions were first being formed in the United States, a lot of the American South was left out of the equation. For various reasons, labor unions didn't want to tackle the racism in the South, didn't want to try to organize African American workers, all sorts of things. So that left this big region of the country ripe for all the mill work in New England to be moved to the South. Once workers began organizing in New England, the South looks like a great place to move that work. There aren't any unions. There's not a tradition of strikes, of struggle. So this giant sucking sound sort of draws all the jobs out of Manchester, New Hampshire, Nashua, Lowell, Lawrence, Fall River, New Bedford, Holyoke, whatever, and it just kind of goes south. As they organize there, then the work goes to Mexico, Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, whatever. Again, places where there's not been a lot of labor organization to speak of, and then eventually it goes again. And so the U.S. labor movement has never really had a global presence or a global perspective. That's changing now too. But it's too slow on the uptake. So these issues still are sort of fundamental to how do we sort of move the rock up the hill further now, especially with all the problems now with income inequality, where the income inequality in America now is the only time it's been worse is in the 1930s. And so we're at a point again where you would assume people are going to organize and try to figure out a way to begin to change the situation. Some of that, I think, is reflected in the presidential election, in what happened with the election, and to the surprise of Republicans. I mean, it's amazing that in our history we don't have elections where people get reelected with an unemployment rate as high as this one was, but nobody felt confident that the Republican candidate was going to do much of anything to improve the lot of workers. And so, you know, it sort of, that seemed to be, re-voting for the president seemed to be the best alternative at that point. So I mean, yeah, that's the other thing I think that we have to think about, and I think people are beginning to think about it now. You don't want, personally, the way I think about this at least, is I don't want the Democratic Party to think automatically it always is going to get a workers' vote. That the vote should have something attached to it. Most other countries, particularly European countries, have workers' parties, have labor parties. We don't. We've had small labor parties and socialist parties and things like that, but they've never risen to any great heights within our electoral system. And since the New Deal, since the Great Depression, Franklin Roosevelt, it's always been assumed union households will vote Democratic. Union households. I mean, that's what my father was a meat cutter, and he told me that from the time I could remember. Mm-hmm. You know, if I ever catch you voting for a Republican, you're in big trouble, son. And so but I don't think that's necessarily a good thing. I think there has to be some push. Right, and I think that's where we are. The lesson of the Bread and Roses strike, in terms of that, is that was not something that was done at the ballot box. Again, that was a broad social movement. All the mills in Lawrence ground to a halt. If you think about it, 25 to 30% of all the wool produced in the country, those mills were silent, and those workers in the middle of the winter, with no money saved up and no way of thinking about where the next check was going to come from, withstood all that pressure from the mill owners, all that pressure from the government, all that pressure from the militia, all what had to have deeply affected them, the plight of their kids, and stood firm in the middle of a really bitter cold winter, and won. It's historic, and people today, I think, should be able to look back at that and draw strength and say, well, if they could do it, why can't we? We at least have ATM and debit cards.
Right. And there was that sense of solidarity, and the groundwork had been done. And just I think opposition just made the unions more powerful among their own. But, you know, there aren't as many unionized people nowadays. The jobs have changed. The jobs have moved. And the anti-union feeling is not just among, you know, the wealthy, I think. I mean, I hear a lot of people from working class backgrounds who, what has the unions ever done for us, and why do we, So what is the future?
Well, I think
some cataclysmic event.
Yeah, no, well, I think, I mean, some of this is a function of being either miseducated or uneducated in school. Labor history is hardly ever taught. And so people take for granted things like a minimum wage or Social Security or Medicare or a 40-hour work week or overtime pay or paid holidays. I can go on,
labor.
I can go on and on and on about all those things that came about because there was a labor movement and because people organized, fought, and in many cases died to push those issues. And so we being teachers, educators, need to do a better job telling that story and helping people understand why they have those things. And so, I mean, I think it's a function of, with, Black Friday and all this crazy business that's coming up again, like people having to work on Thanksgiving, a much stronger labor movement probably would be able to say, no, people should not be shopping on Thanksgiving night. Stores shouldn't be opening at 10 p.m. on Thanksgiving Day. They should be closed. That's a holiday. Right. Everybody deserves a day with their family and whatever and whatever. And, that struggle came out of the labor movement, and now people have been so persuaded to think they've got to shop that they forget, they lose their mind in terms of thinking about what's really important. Why do you have to go shop on Thursday night at 10 p.m. after you've eaten turkey and been with your family all day? Why? And
watched football or whatever you do.
Yeah, I mean, do whatever you do, but do it with your, I remember as a kid liking Thanksgiving almost more than Christmas. Especially when I was like 12, 13, 14, it just seemed like a better holiday to me than just ripping stuff open and breaking it. And so, but
with the boxes.
Yeah, we've moved away from that into this idea again that we have to consume stuff, and that somehow if we don't get there at 10 p.m., get in line. So that means people are going to probably be getting in line at 6 p.m. so they can be the first one into Walmart for 10 p.m. Why? Why are we doing that to ourselves? We need to really have a much better sort of handle on where we got all these benefits from that we've taken for granted. And if at the end of it all, you think about it all out there in the watching audience and you figure, well, we don't need those things, then whatever, I can't help you. If you don't want to have minimum wages and you don't want to have legal work weeks and holidays and things like that,
and time with your family.
Yeah, I guess that's obviously you're entitled to that under our political and economic and social system. You're entitled to that point of view, but why?
Exactly. The 40-hour week is almost a joke now.
Yeah, now it's crazy, right?
Yeah,
now too many people are working part-time, working 3 part-time jobs to make what a good 40-hour-a-week job with benefits would have given them 15 or 20 years ago. And so that's that's part of what we have to think about again as well. But I look to the history as a way to think, well, how were people able to sort of advance, those issues over time in the 20th century? And the strike in Lawrence is a perfect example in history of a moment when people said, okay, enough.
Right.
Enough is enough. We deserve better than this. We're people. This isn't fair. This isn't equal. We're working really hard, but we're seeing our kids dying. Lawrence had one of the highest, not only the highest infant mortality rate, one of the highest mortality rates for kids under the age of 5. Every family in the city of Lawrence was scarred by that. Everybody knew somebody who had lost a baby.
Yeah.
The cumulative effect of that, again, is part of what put people out in the streets in 1912. And so the same way now, I'm sure everybody knows somebody, if they think about it, who lost their home to foreclosure, or who has elderly parent or whatnot that can't get medical care. We're right back where we were before. We have to see what our commonalities are. That we have more in common than different, and we have to figure out how to realize that and move with it.
And that's a good place to end. Inspired, I hope. Thank you so much, Bob. It's great.
Thanks for having me here.
Speak with you.
I love being here.
All right. We'll see you next time on Thinking Out Loud.